For the past 10 months, we have been encouraged to keep our distance, to not gather in large groups. So it's somewhat jarring to read that when John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, people from the whole Judean countryside and all the people of Jerusalem went to see him and listen to him, and some were baptised in the river. On reading the opening verses of the Gospel according to Mark, I picture a scene of people milling about, crowding in when John made an utterance, and others lining up by the river, awaiting their turn for baptism. In my mind's eye, there are no masks, no social distancing, no head counts, and obviously no sign-in sheets or QR codes. At the beginning of Mark's account of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, we find a scene of earnest interest in the teachings of a prophet who many believe was the fulfilment of an ancient prophecy. We read that people came from many regions and towns to hear the preacher and to receive baptism. There was obviously something new and hopeful about what he was saying, and word spread throughout the land. People came in droves. They came because they were seeking newness. And they came because they needed something to hope for. And rumour had it that John, who had appeared in the wilderness, in his simple clothing and austere diet, had it. I can still remember what it feels like to be part of a big crowd, to be close to friends and strangers as we enjoy a concert, sit at a school assembly or worship together. Oh, those heady days. I've reflected this week on what it would have been like to be a member of the crowds who went to see and hear John on the banks of the River Jordan. Here is my attempt at putting myself in the shoes of a first-century bystander, someone who observed and reflected on John's ministry and message. I was curious about the new prophet that appeared in the wilderness. I was in the markets buying food for the family when I first heard people talking about a man called John hanging out by the river, preaching and baptising people. There was a real buzz about this man. People were excited and curious about what he was saying and doing. It wasn't just at the markets I was hearing about John, but at worship and from neighbours and friends. He was clearly a powerful preacher. Lots of people were going to hear him, and some were being baptised in the river as a symbol of washing away the old and beginning a new life. The people who had been to the river had changed. They seemed more hopeful. They had found joy amongst the daily challenges of life. At the market and in other places, we talked about the prophet, and we talked about how he was changing people. Now, there was a lot of speculation about who John was, where he had come from, and on whose authority he spoke. Some wondered if he was the Messiah, the long-promised, long-anticipated Messiah. Others thought he was more likely to be the forerunner of the Messiah, a figure the prophet Isaiah had spoken of, one who would prepare the way for the Messiah. I didn't want to get my hopes up. Even in my lifetime there had been try-hard leaders who had promised us the world and delivered very little. And the old people, those with longer memories, said it had been a very long time since a reliable prophet had graced us with their presence. The general consensus was that we hadn't had a decent prophet since the likes of Isaiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And we longed for leaders and prophets like Moses and Elijah to bring us hope and new life, to lead us in the ways of God. What we really longed and hoped for was the appearance among us of the promised Messiah, but we didn't dare to dream too big. The prophets of old had spoken often about a Messiah who would be sent by God, a king who would come from the stump of Jesse, from the house of David. This Messiah would bring a new, peaceable kingdom to earth. A kingdom of justice and peace. A kingdom of safety where a lion could lie down with a lamb and children could play with snakes. But we had waited a long time, and sometimes it seemed like a pipe dream. But we continued to hear the promises of the prophets in our worship, and the promises gave us hope that the future would be better. Let's be honest, the future had to be better. We endured many hardships. Many babies died. A lot of people were poor and hungry. Those unfortunates born with a disability or who developed leprosy were shunned. We worked hard in the fields, in workshops and keeping house. We worried about the sick and we mourned our dead. Our lives were hard and challenging. There were days when the feelings of hopelessness threatened to overwhelm. When John appeared in the wilderness, we were living under Roman rule. The mighty Roman Empire had taken over our country and our lives. Roman soldiers patrolled the streets and we paid taxes to the emperor. Living in an occupied country had brought many more stressors into our lives. During the occupation, many hoped that the promised Messiah would be a mighty warrior, a great military leader who would gather an army to overthrow the occupying forces. We longed for freedom, we longed for peace, and we believed that when the Messiah came, we would find both. We longed for the promised Messiah to come, but we were also cautious. Each time our hopes had been dashed, we moved on. We picked ourselves up and continued to look for signs of hope. Then one day, out of the blue, a new prophet set up camp by the banks of the River Jordan. At first no one knew who he was or where he had come from. But he was someone who attracted a crowd, so I went to see for myself. I found out his name was John, and he was quite a sight. He was dressed in a camel's hair tunic with a leather belt around his waist. Someone in the crowd told me John had been living in the wilderness and that he only ate locusts and wild honey. And I believed them. He was very thin and gaunt looking. Even though he looked a bit rough around the edges, the things he was saying made sense. They were hopeful. The people in the crowd seemed happier and lighter in their being, having spent time with John. And there were an awful lot of people. Day after day they came to hear John's preaching and to receive his baptism. Afterwards, when it was all over, after John had been killed by Herod, after Jesus' 3-year ministry and his untimely death and miraculous resurrection, we talked about those fascinating days by the river. We reflected on John's simple message and what it meant, about who and what he was alluding to. And we came to the conclusion that John had been sent among us to prepare the way for the Messiah. John had tried to tell us. He made it clear that he was preparing the way for one who was more powerful than him, one who would baptize people with the Spirit. And we remembered the prophets of old teaching that one would be sent to prepare the way for the Messiah. When we thought about it, John fitted the bill. He was the warm-up act, drawing our attention to the important events that would soon take place, getting people ready to hear and respond to Jesus' ministry and message. The importance of getting us ready cannot be underestimated. We were a weary and cynical people. It was going to take a lot of convincing for us to genuinely believe the Messiah had come. But what John was saying and doing seemed to fit the prophecies of Isaiah. The promises that were made when the people were living in exile and desperate to find their way home. The prophet promised that God would rescue the people, that the roads in the wilderness would be made straight for our God to enable the rescue and restoration of the people. The imagery the prophet used was always moving and hopeful. Rough paths being made smooth, valleys lifted up and mountains and hills made low. The journey of life is one of highs and lows, of moments of great joy and deep sadness or disappointment. We all experience rough paths in relationships, health, work or school. Isaiah promised that one day these highs and lows would be made more even. And through this change in circumstances, the people of God will be more open to looking for signs of the kingdom of God breaking into the world. Along with all the other people who went to see and hear John at the river, I came to believe that he was the one who had been sent by God to prepare our hearts and minds to see and believe that Jesus of Nazareth was coming to minister amongst us and that he was the Messiah. It was not long after John began preaching and baptizing people that Jesus of Nazareth came to John seeking baptism. It was not long after John's ministry began that Jesus' ministry of healing and hope started, and our hopes began to improve. John the Baptist, as he became known, was one out of the box. He stood out because of his appearance. But once you listen to his message about leaving behind your old life and finding a new life in the promised kingdom of God, you realised he also stood out for his passion, his joy and hope. It is little wonder that the crowd of people from all over Judea and the city of Jerusalem came to see and hear. In the season of Advent, we prepare ourselves for the celebration of the birth of the Christ child. We recall the prophecies of old and the people who helped prepare hearts and minds to receive the Messiah. The story of John the Baptist draws on ancient promises and challenges us to keep our hearts and minds open to moments of hope and joy. Sometimes these moments will come from unexpected sources, sometimes in a crowd, but always offered with love, with the love and care of a shepherd who gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close as a mother sheep gently leads the flock. Amen.